Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey people, today we're going to take a look at Star Trek Frontiers from WizKids. This is a thematic reimagining of the game Mage Knight, the board game, also from WizKids, both designed by Vlad Chvátil, and this one was reimagined by the designer Andrew Parks. Now, Mage Knight, the board game, was actually based off of, thematically, it was based off of Mage Knight, the miniatures game that WizKids also did, but what the board game was a very heavy strategy game about taking a fantasy warrior across a countryside through different scenarios, trying to either protect villages or sack villages and monasteries, fighting off monsters, building a little collection of troops under your control, and there was deck building elements involved. Star Trek Frontiers, we'll talk more about this in my final thoughts, but mechanically speaking is very similar to the original Mage Knight, the board game, but is, instead of the fantasy theme, it has, of course, the Star Trek theme. And when I say the Star Trek theme, I want to be very specific here. It is the Star Trek TV series theme of the 80s through the early 2000s. So you have characters from Next Generation depicted in screenshot imagery, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and even for some bizarre reason, that stupid Picard clone from the worst Star Trek movie, Star Trek Nemesis, but that's a whole other rant I could go on. But those are the kind of characters that you're going to find in this game, and you'll take control of ships like the Enterprise and the Defiance, and then a couple of random Klingon warships, and you're trying to take those throughout the galaxy instead of a fantasy universe, trying to either interact with planets and go on away missions, or fight off Romulan warbirds, and of course, in most of the scenarios, what you're trying to do is fight off the Borg, who are in this, you're all in, this unknown sector of the galaxy, overrun by the Borg and the Dominion, and there's actually big Borg cubes that you may have to fight off against. So, the game is very, very complicated, just like the original Mage Knight, the board game. So, this overview is already going to be long enough as it is, but I can't go into every single detail, just know that ahead of time. I'll tell you what I can just to give you a taste of what the gameplay is like. Then we're going to come back, I'll let you know what I think. Star Trek Frontiers is a heavy strategy game for 1 to 4 players. It is a retheming of the game Mage Knight, the board game. Instead of fantasy warriors, each player has control of a different starship and captain from either the Federation or Klingon Empire, exploring and waging war in a mysterious sector of the galaxy overrun by the Dominion and the Borg. This is a scenario-driven game, and depending on which one is chosen, the game could be competitive, cooperative, or semi-cooperative. It's also possible for every scenario to be converted to a solo scenario using a simple dummy player, although there is one specific scenario that is strictly for solo play. Furthermore, it's up to the players to decide in each multiplayer game whether or not player versus player combat is allowed. Winning the game can mean multiple things: exploring, destroying certain enemies, fighting the other players, getting more experience points, etc. After you've chosen your scenario, keeping its special rules in mind, you can begin the standard setup. Every player chooses a different starship and captain. You'll take a ship miniature and its card, which will always be face up in front of you. You'll also get a deck of starting cards, which includes a card representing your captain, and you'll shuffle these up and draw 5. This is a deck building game as well, so you'll be adding more cards to your deck as the game continues. More on these later. You'll have a stack of level up tokens placed in descending order with the level 1 and 2 token face up on the stack. These have your maximum hand limit and defense value and will increase as you go through more tokens. A blank token is placed ship side up off to the side, representing a control token for the crew. Finally, there are several other bits you'll gather, like skill tokens, faction tokens, and an away team token. Next, you'll lay out the experience and reputation board. Everyone will put a faction token on each of these in the 0 space. As you gain experience by exploring, fighting enemies, and interacting with planets, you'll move down levels of the track, and you'll level up and gain new cards, new skills, and flip up level tokens. For reputation, you will gain or lose traction on this gauge by either being diplomatic or threatening. Either way, the positive or negative number will thereafter modify your diplomacy attempts. There is also a data core board. This board serves the dual purpose of reminding you how many move points you need to move through certain parts of space, and it's also where you store data dice that are rolled each round. Data dice are the primary way to get data tokens, which lets you boost your cards. There are several other decks of cards that players may have access to during the course of the game. Advanced actions are like much better versions of the cards you start off with in your deck. You'll lay 3 of these out at random. You'll do the same with undiscovered cards, which are even more powerful but also very difficult to acquire. Regular crew members are laid out at random depending on the number of players. These are characters who will join you if you have open command tokens. They don't enter your deck, but rather chill out on your ship and wait for you to help you with their abilities. You may eventually have a chance to attain golden elite crew members who only become available when you get to certain parts of the galaxy. Rounding out the cards, you'll also place off to the side damage cards, which you'll be forced to take at times and which clog up your hand and your deck, turn order cards, which I'll go over soon, and a whole stack of reference cards, which you'll desperately need. You'll also make stacks of data tokens, crew wound tokens, and transport tokens. One of the most important aspects of the game are the space tiles. Scenarios will always tell you how many to use, and they're always broken down into normal frontier tiles and red core tiles, which will get placed underneath the frontier tiles in a face-down deck. You'll always start with the tile that contains a wormhole everyone's ship starts off on, and it's surrounded by asteroid fields that you can't go through. This signifies that the board must spread out and forward, usually cone-like. There are symbols and numbers whose placement will tell you how they get placed as you explore. Every tile has features that the players can interact with. Some are benign and helpful, like outposts, research stations, and dry docks, but there are also planets you can send away teams to, or decimate if you're so inclined. Many tokens can be attacked, including Romulan ships, Dominion and Romulan starbases, and the dreaded Borg cubes and Borg spheres. The latter two will only show up when you get to the core tiles, and they are usually the goals of the scenarios. Borg cubes have their own miniatures, each of the 4 of which has a different color and slightly different stats corresponding to those colors. They also have levels that you keep track of on their HeroClick spaces. When you fight a Borg cube, you actually fight a swarm of tokens. Speaking of that, most objects you interact with are represented by randomized tokens. They'll get placed on the map until ships move near them or interact with them, depending on which token it is. The other side of the token will have stats, again depending on what kind of potential threat they pose, including attack, defense, countermeasures, diplomacy, etc. The game is played in a certain number of rounds, depending on the guidelines of the scenario. Rounds are very long and consist of each player taking several turns. When one player runs out of cards in their deck but still has cards in hand, they have the option of forgoing their final turn and initiating the end of the round. Every other player gets one more turn, and then that's it. If you have no cards at all left, you must declare the end. Every round you'll have to re-roll 6-sided data dice into the data core depending on the number of players. Dice faces represent different types of data that you can gain and use to boost your cards. There's 3 basic colors, red, yellow, and blue, and white, which is wild and can count as any of the basic 3. There's also purple, which is used for powerful specialty cards, and black data, which is specifically used for boosting undiscovered cards and on other certain rare occasions. On your turn, you can take and use one of these dice, and then afterwards roll it and return it to the board for the other players to use. On subsequent rounds, you'll also cycle out old cards in each of the offerings, refresh player skills and crew members, and so on. At the beginning of the game, you'll randomize the round order tokens just so that you can determine who gets to pick their tactic card first. The numbers of these cards are the real way you'll determine the order of the round, with 1 always going first. However, if you're willing to take a slower card, you can get a powerful special ability, like drawing extra cards, having an extra die to use, and even getting an extra turn if you're willing to go last. After that, players take their turns in order until someone calls for the end of the round. On subsequent rounds, you actually determine the turn order of who gets to take their tactic cards based on experience. The first thing you can do on your turn, optionally, is move your ship. You start from the wormhole and move out into the galaxy. Every regular sector costs you 2 points of movement, but other sectors may cost more. You play cards that give you movement points, as many as you want, to gain enough movement to do what you want to do. You can enhance this in 2 ways. First, even if you don't have cards that give you movement points outright, you can use improvised cards to do so. You turn your other cards sideways as you play them, and they will count as one extra move, and you ignore the rest of the text on the card. In fact, this works for almost any of the basic actions that you can do, getting shields, attack points, diplomacy, etc. The other way to boost your cards is with data. Every card is a different color and can be boosted with a corresponding colored data token. The token can come from your one die you can take for the turn, or data crystals that you're able to store on your ship. If you do this, you can use the more powerful bottom effect of the card. You can also use your movement points to explore. If you're at a clear edge of one of the tiles during your move action, you can spend 2 points of movement to flip a tile off the stack and line it up in that direction, matching symbols and making sure the number is at the bottom. If you still have even more movement points left, you can keep moving afterwards. Once you're done moving, you can take actions. This depends entirely on what you end up next to. If you're at an outpost, for instance, you could repair your ship, which is removing damage cards, or use diplomacy from your cards to recruit crew members from the offer if they have the outpost symbol. Crew members can only stay under your control if you have command tokens available, and each crew member can only use their abilities once per round. After that, you'll have to wait until next round when they become ready again, though as long as they're ready, they can go on as many away missions as they want. When the core tiles are revealed, elite crew members can enter the offer, and sometimes the revelation of planets on the map will allow advanced action cards to actually go into the crew offer for purchase. There are other beneficial areas like dry docks and research stations, which will get you data tokens if you start and end there respectively. If you move next to Romulan ships, you'll probably have to fight. If you don't initiate the battle yourself, you will provoke a fight by moving next to one and then trying to move away or near it. You can also fight things like Dominion and Romulan bases, and of course Borg cubes. Without getting too deep into it, battles consist of you playing cards with attack in order to meet or beat the enemy's defense rating. At the same time, in order to avoid damage cards being placed into your hand, you'll have to also play shield cards to block the enemy's token's damage. If you can't block all the damage with shields, you can still reduce the damage by your captain's defense rating, which is on your face-up token, but you'll still take at least 1 damage and then reduce the remaining damage by your defense rating, and then if there's any damage left, you must take another damage card and then reduce what's left, etc. Special long-range attack cards can effectively act like Magic the Gathering's first strike in this game, allowing you to destroy a token before they ever get to hit you, and you may eventually gain access to advanced tech like photon torpedoes to help you out in battle as well. But enemies also have nasty effects, like chemical attacks and halving your damage. If you interact with a planet, however, it usually involves sending down an away team and completing challenges by spending data, or having your captain and crew members fight an enemy themselves. Diplomacy can play a large role in these instead of violence. The purpose of doing most of these actions, by the way, aside from possible scenario objectives, is getting experience points to level up, which gets you advancement cards, which are souped up versions of your basic cards, getting more control tokens, bigger hand size, and skill tokens. Skill tokens give you once per turn or once per round abilities, and you may even be able to take your opponent's tokens that they didn't choose, and vice versa. Things like planets and space stations can even give you access to undiscovered cards, which are amazing but costly cards. Even the basic ability of these cards must be paid for with data, and the advanced ability requires a normal data and black data to activate as well, but again, the effects are pretty profound. After your turn is done, you'll discard only what you played and then redraw up to your hand limit, hopefully not drawing all damage cards, which will then cause your ship to become crippled. Honestly, there's a lot more to this game, and I could keep going, but that hopefully gives you a taste of Star Trek Frontiers. Now, for people who are completely new to this, who never played Mage Knight the board game, all you want to know is Star Trek Frontiers a good game? Yes, it is. And I'm going to elaborate that on that in a few minutes. Just give me a moment here, because there's a couple things I want to address up front. First and foremost, people who know my channel know that I had a troubled history with Mage Knight the board game. Not like, it was an alcoholic and was beating me, or kind of troubled history. But I liked Mage Knight the board game, but it was too long, too heavy, too complicated. I could never get it to the table, and I ended up getting rid of it. It was one of the very first board games I got when I got into modern board gaming. It was too much for me at the time. I decided eventually to revisit it because people say it was a very good solo experience, and I've enjoyed it more since then, although I don't play it very often. And so it's interesting because Star Trek Frontiers, for those who really want to know this bit of information, who have played Mage Knight the board game before, this game is really, really similar. I mean, I thought there would be a few more significant differences, but as far as I can tell, and I didn't even recall most of this, I had to do some internet searching myself because I hadn't played Mage Knight the board game in a long time, and even if I had, I wouldn't be able to pick out these kind of differences easily. But there are differences in how combat goes down, as far as like in Mage Knight the board game, I think you have to spend movement points to go into assault places, and you have to, it's assaulting fortresses is a lot more difficult, and it seems like the combat in this game is not only a little more streamlined, but also a little more forgiving. But even so, as a whole, this is really similar. And even though I hadn't played Mage Knight in a long time, as I was sitting there going through the rules and explaining it to people at the table the first time that we played Frontiers, I was like, I just kept saying over and over again, wow, this is really like Mage Knight. To the point where it's probably annoying the other players. Because that's what I was getting, like everything started flooding back into my mind. Which raises the interesting question for people who played Mage Knight the board game and are thinking about getting this. Should you have both? And honestly, I do not believe the differences are significant enough that one of them is clearly better from a mechanical standpoint. You could make an argument that the theme fits better for Star Trek, because I think it does, actually. I was actually surprised by how well the theme transferred over, and then it's like, yeah, actually, it kind of makes more sense that you're going through the galaxy instead of like this fantasy world, just kind of wandering around like Link from Zelda, but like an evil Link who can kill monasteries. So I do think that the theme fits better here, but ultimately that's what's going to happen. It's going to come down to, do you prefer Star Trek or do you like Fantasy Warriors? Now, I like Star Trek a lot. I do. I especially the series that are depicted here, Deep Space Nine and Next Generation in particular, I really loved. So I appreciate that, but again, I am leaning more towards, I always like fantasy more than science fiction. Now, I happen to own them both. I'm not going to get rid of one, so I'm going to keep them both. But if you only have one or the other, if you're happy with Mage Knight the board game, you probably don't need this one. And if you don't have either of them, but you want one of them, if you like Star Trek more, you won't go wrong getting this one. Now, having said all that, I did promise that if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'd actually tell you what is good about this game and what is not so good about it. So the good stuff is that this is a very heavy strategy game, and it's kind of an efficiency game in a lot of different ways. But while it is heavy and it's very difficult to get into for the first time or the first few times, I think there's a really big payoff here. I love the way that deck building is integrated into the game. I love deck building as a mechanism, and people always point to the original Mage Knight the board game as a true harbinger of what was to come with deck building, as far as being integrated into a larger board game, not just being a simple card game on its own. And Star Trek Frontiers, of course, being similar to Mage Knight, does that as well. And it's very interesting how it works, where you start off with a very basic deck, and you can potentially get more cards in through the advanced cards, the undiscovered cards, and that's it, basically. But it's very slow going. You don't build up a deck very quickly like you would in a traditional deck building game. And while I would hate that most of the time in other games, I appreciate it here because when you do get a new card, it has a profound effect on your deck. It is like awesome. Even if it doesn't seem like a big deal, it really improves it. So you can feel yourself getting stronger. When you get a new command token flipped over and you get a higher hand limit, you're like, yes, it's amazing. So I love and getting even skills makes you feel much stronger. And I love the way the skills work too, where there's a public offer. I didn't go over that in the overview very well, but you could potentially get other people's skills too. So I really love the progression in this game. But that progression, again, it makes you feel very strong, but it's very kind of slow going. That's sort of the pace of the game. And everything is about efficiency. So you're moving throughout the map. You have to very, very carefully determine how you're going to use your cards to move, and then do you want to risk on the same turn that you moved going for an assault, or do you wait and go for an all-out assault on a Romulan ship or a star base or whatever the case may be on your next turn? But if you're in a competitive game, your opponents might be going for the same target that you are. Are they going to get to it first? Or you may just not have that many turns in a round. Even if you're doing okay with your deck, where you have a lot of cards left in your deck and you're doing fine with your hand management, other players could be burning through their cards really quickly, and if they're doing that, they're going to end the round sooner. So how many turns do you actually have? You don't know. So you're going to have, it's like a risk-reward thing. How much do I risk now potentially failing? Now, failing in this game is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but down the road it can be. Because failing in combat, I mean in particular, because if you take too many damage cards, that's a serious problem. In other deck building games, again, this is not strictly a deck building game, but just to talk about that for a minute. In other deck building games, it can be kind of easy to get rid of cards from your deck, or to at least discard cards. In this game, you can't even discard damage cards that you've taken to your hand until the end of the round, or unless you have some kind of other special effects going on. That's a big deal, because you only have so many cards that you can redraw every turn, and then if they go into your deck, that's going to be a huge problem for you down the road. So repairing is very, very critical in this game. But since I mentioned healing, we'll talk about the crew members, because the crew members are another vital resource that you have to use so sparingly, because they can only be used once per round. You can take them on a bunch of away missions, but the second you use one of their abilities, and they all have like 3 or 4 abilities, so you're like, well, I think it's only 3, but it's like, oh, what do I use it on? Some of them have different abilities depending on whether they're on away missions or whether they are helping you just fighting a Romulan starship, for instance. So what do you use them on there? Do you use them for attack? Do you use them for shields? Are you willing to take a damage card now in combat in general in order to save a card that you really don't want to spend for another shield? Stuff like that is really important and integral to the game. And while I can understand the frustration people can feel with that, I probably did when I played Mage Knight the first few times years ago, and I could see the frustration on the faces of some of the people I played Frontiers with. I like that. I just like that critical thinking of there's not necessarily a terrible move that you can make, but there's a better move, and it's figuring out what that is and what's going to be the most efficient for you that I just kind of really enjoy. There's tons of options in this game, lots of different things you can do on the map, how you interact with the planets, how you go on the away missions, the different bases. Do you go take a reputation hit to essentially sack one of those Dominion bases or Romulan bases because the benefits are great? How warlike do you want to be? Do you not care? Even if it's funny to be Picard in the Enterprise and going around just randomly destroying things or decimating planets. But you can have the option to do that. And the scenarios, of course, change everything dramatically. Much like with the original Mage Knight, I think I prefer to play this game solo, but it doesn't matter how you prefer to play it, there's something for you there. Full-on competitive. Competitive with player versus player, which can be, you can decide to do that or not do it depending on the scenario, or just not do it. There's fully cooperative, semi-cooperative. There's a really great tutorial reconnaissance mission, purely solo. Almost any of the missions can be made solo if you really want to. So there's not like a ton of different scenarios, but there's enough that keeps it very, very varied. Sounds weird. So lots of variety, lots of stuff to do. Really great and interesting mechanisms. Love flipping over the tiles. Component-wise, it's okay. It's comparable to the original Mage Knight, which had its own problems. I hate that they keep using still shots of the show. Why does Fantasy Flight... Why are they the only ones that came up with a great idea when they had the Star Wars license to have beautiful new artwork made for the game that really enhances it, but WizKids continues to rely on still shots? I mean, like they did with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Dice Masters, which was awful. I don't know. I wish they'd get over that. The ships are okay. The board cubes are cool. And the other tokens and things are fine quality. The card quality seems okay to me. So it's not like stellar. Even the box is kind of cheap. But I can't complain too much. It wasn't a concern for me, at least. Other people might feel differently. As long as they keep that consistent between expansions, which was a huge problem that Mage Knight had, I won't have too much of a problem with it. I assume there will be expansions for this game. So that being said, what are the problems with this game? Well, I mean the major problems. Well, it's the same major problems Mage Knight had. It's incredibly long. it has an incredibly steep learning curve. There are 2 rulebooks in this game. One just to get you through your first game, which is itself like, 10, 15 pages. And then the full rulebook, which has everything else you need for all the other scenarios, including the scenarios. Really difficult to teach because of that. Really difficult to learn yourself the first time. I had to relearn it, essentially, because I hadn't played Mage Knight in so long. But it helped that I'd played before. Other people I played with to try to teach them, and these are smart people, but it's a deep, heavy game. I can't stress enough how long it is. Players' turns are very long. So the downtime in the game is excruciating at times, which again is one of the reasons why I prefer to play it solo, more so than a lot of other games that I have, just because of how bad that downtime is, no matter what you do to try to shave that time down. And yes, I know there's people who are very adept at this and can keep the time down low. I always get criticized for my group taking too long, but I think anyone would have a hard time keeping the time low in this game. And it can be very unforgiving. It's a very unforgiving game. So I cannot make a blanket statement that everyone should run out and buy this or Mage Knight the board game. I just can't. It's just not going to be for everyone. And it's something I had to grow into appreciating, the system, whether it's Star Trek or Mage Knight. But I do think it's a great game. I think it's very excellently designed. I think it's very, very strong thematically. Going on away missions, fighting the Romulans and the Borgs, etc., getting the crew members. Really love all of that stuff and that flavor. I wish it was a little bit more user-friendly and the barrier of entry was lower. But if it's your kind of game, I think you'll really enjoy it if you're not afraid of heavy games. And then it just comes down to whether you prefer fantasy or Star Trek. If you like both, whatever, get both. That is Star Trek Frontiers from WizKids. I recommend it for the right people.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.